So I'm going to not so much tell you things that I think you need to do, but I'm going to tell you things I think you need to be thinking about. We know the hay that we're producing, or those of you that are thinking about producing new crops, but it probably fits along the lines of alfalfa, orchard grass, timothy. So I want to give you some ideas to consider, and part of it may be, one or two of the species I mentioned. You said, no way I'm going to produce that for hay, but it may bring in your mind something that would be a profitable thing for you to produce. So there's about 50 or more forages that we can grow in Kentucky. There's a huge list. Some of them you recognize, some of them you probably never even thought about. In fact, there's even one here that's kind of a bad name, Johnson grass, but is a very high quality forage. So it's probably not something you're going to be growing as a cash hay producer. But there's a lot of things here you can grow. But I want to mention a few that do have some market value, and a lot of it is untapped market value. So the first thing I want to mention is red clover. And someone asked about selling that to horse folks. Claiborne Farm in Bourbon County, they used to swear by red clover for their horses. They would ship it in from Michigan. I was at the farm about 15 years ago. I'm not sure if they could even get it in anymore. So it can fit very well even in horse rations. But the average horse owner is scared of it because of the potential that those later cuts sometimes can have that black fungus with slobbers. But I'm not going to refer to that. I'm going to talk about some huge benefits that red clover can provide far beyond what we normally think about with the nitrogen benefits and the quality benefits. And I'm going to highlight work that the USDA ARS lab there in Lexington has done. Michael Fleif, the current director there, Glenn Aiken, the past director, Isabel Kagan, Brittany Harlow, Jimmy Klotz have all worked on different aspects of how red clover, the additional benefits it gives outside of just what you might think about. So in the rumen, when a cow is, or any ruminant animal is eating forage, they're crunching it up, they're breaking it up, it's getting down into the rumen, it becomes little fragments, and there's millions of bacteria that are attacking that fiber components inside the forage. And so they're able to break it down, and as they break it down, then it gets into components that the animal can actually absorb. So obviously, if we're eating hay, it's going to just pass right through us. We're not going to really get any energy out of it. But ruminant animals have that ability with those bacteria in their rumen. It's like a big fermentation vat to break it down. And most of those bacteria are beneficial species, meaning that they're breaking down the fiber so it's more available. But there are a number of bacteria that we would consider wasteful species, meaning they're not really doing any good for the animal. One of the most problem one is called a hyperammonium producing bacteria. They're breaking down the protein in the forage, producing ammonia, a nitrogen containing compound, and then that's excreted, most of it in the urine, so it's wasted. Now you could say, well, it is a fertilizer on the grass. It is, but it's not. That protein is not getting down to the small intestine where it's absorbed, and you're actually getting weight gain from it or milk production from it. So we obviously want beneficial species. We don't want those wasteful species. So an easy way to knock out those wasteful species is an antibiotic-type growth promoter like Rumensin. It's going to kill those wasteful bacteria and provide more gain. So typically, given Rumensin at the recommended dosage, you can get about a quarter pound more daily gain for nothing more than giving this little bit of extra component. But it's not an antibiotic like some of the ones that we would take if we had pneumonia, but it is an antibiotic-type compound. And so those kind of have a bad name, some for good reasons, some for not such good reasons. But just like herbicides and other chemicals, there's a lot of criticism about using some of these compounds. So when the USDA lab there in Lexington, it had been there for many years, but then they had discontinued it. But in about 2002, it started back. And one of their main goals was, what can we do to find new growth promoters from plants? they've actually found some really unique compounds in hops that could be used as growth promoters in animals. The problem was it's pretty expensive to grow hops, and they don't grow that well in Kentucky, so that was kind of a curiosity. That was interesting, but didn't really help us that much. But they found one in red clover. In fact, they found several. Some of you heard some of the aspects of this talk before, but I want you to think about it today from the standpoint of, is there potential in the hay market? So Dr. Taylor was the red clover breeder in Kentucky for almost 60 years. He worked from the time he was a grad student up through about 3 months before he passed away in 2008. He was 86. And he developed a lot of new red clover lines. But when Dr. Isabel Kagan got to looking at this issue, and Dr. Flife, about what are plant compounds that can be beneficial, they got together, started working together, and they found this compound called biocanin A. It's a phytoestrogen isoflavone. So when we talk about isoflavones in plants, it's just a broad group of compounds, and the biocanin A is one example. And it inhibits the hyperammonium-producing bacteria. And it's found in high quantities in red clover. So you can buy biocanin A by itself and dose it to an animal and get this benefit, but it's very expensive. But it naturally occurs in red clover. Much higher compounds in red clover than found in other legumes like alfalfa or white clover. So where does that fit in a system? So just a couple of little bits of data, and I've got a bit more in your proceedings in another publication over there. So biocanin A, we know we can prove that it decreases the rumen ammonium production by those hyperammonium-producing bacteria and gives higher gain. This one study here, pasture only, was a little above 1.5 pounds a day of gain. Giving dried distillers, took it up 14%. Adding the biocanin A took it up over 2 pounds. So about a quarter of a pound higher gain from biocanin A. And giving 20% red clover in the diet gives the same benefits to giving just the straight biocanin A. I mean, it's fine if you give more than 20% red clover, but you get up to that amount, you start getting these growth promoter effects just from the fact of knocking out those wasteful bacteria. There was this publication, a ruminant growth promoter you can grow, that Dr. Flife wrote in Hay and Forage Grower. You can still look this up, and I've got in the proceedings a link to a couple of other publications you can look for. So if you're thinking about, now, like I say, you probably aren't going to sell red clover to your typical horse customer. But for a beef cattle producer that wants to have higher gain, more so than just the quality of the forage, here's a way to be feeding a natural growth promoter. Someone that's raising grass-fed beef, maybe they want to promote that they're an all-natural product. They're not giving any hormones or antibiotic or any compounds like that. They're going to get much of that same benefit by feeding red clover or a red clover grass mixture. And let me mention a couple of other things, and I'll mention some more options. So, great benefit of red clover. Now, it turns out that red clover has other amazing properties. It can fix 150 or more pounds of nitrogen per year into the soil, so it's got some good properties just in and of its own. But it's long been recognized, and everybody in the room would know this, toxic tall fescue pastures, animals have a hard time, but if it's overseeded with clovers, they do better. And we used to think, and in fact, until about 12 years ago, I always said this. I would stand up here and say, if you put clover in with toxic tall fescue, you get better animal performance because you're diluting the toxins. But there's a lot more than just the dilution, and that's what I'll mention. I mentioned it already with the growth promotion. So Dr. Kagan and Dr. Flife and the group there, they started looking into the medical literature, the human literature of what are natural compounds that can be beneficial. And they found out that red clover supplements have been used over time to reduce blood pressure. And they started saying, what could this maybe do from an animal standpoint? These are actually those little donut-shaped things over there. I wouldn't want to show this when we were about to eat donuts this morning, but these are cross-sections of a blood vessel taken out of the caudal artery of in the leg of an animal. And what you're seeing is the one on the bottom is just kind of the normal size. You know, the hole in the middle is where the blood flows through. The one at the top is where a tall fescue seed extract, where they've just taken the seed and mixed that with the alcohol compound and fed it to the animal. And the blood vessel constricted, tightened to about 50% of normal. So that's one of the big problems with toxic tall fescue, is it's a vasoconstrictor. If the vessels are constricted, there's been increased instances of fescue foot happening this winter with the cold weather. Blood flow's not getting to the feet. If someone's feeding pure tall fescue hay, or maybe they're grazing a stockpiled pasture back before we got so cold and got some doses. So it's a real problem. So here's animals on steers. Again, that caudal artery, you can take out a section of that artery and not hurt the animal, so they can do this on live animals and do those cross sections. This was actually where they were looking at it with a ultrasound. So Bermuda grass, just a normal hay, grass hay, this was the size of the artery. When they fed toxic infected fescue with the alkaloids like the ergovaline, it reduced to about half of the normal size. Okay, what you're seeing here is after 8 days of just about a third of the ration, red clover, the blood vessel dilated out to about 80 to 90% of normal. So this amazing benefit, even quite quickly after the animal has been in this severe vasoconstriction type situation. And it turns out, and you'll see in my proceedings article, that they found that this particular benefit, this is not the bile-canin A, but another isoflavone, that even an ounce of powdered red clover leaves mixed in with mineral will give this vasodilation effect. And so again, if you're thinking of what are some new markets that I can maybe, new hay markets, having red clover for the growth benefits, even small amounts of red clover in the diet for this vasodilation benefit could be a new market for you. Jonathan Stevens, Jonathan, raise your hand, is a graduate student with Chris and I, and he's looking at what about if we want to capture the leaves in red clover, it might be useful to dry it, maybe particularly if we're even going to take the leaves off and powder it, and he's looking at different temperature effects, if that's going to hurt the stability of these compounds. You found so far, Jonathan, that you can heat it up to how much? And 220 and not affect the stability of those compounds. So research with bile-canin A as a growth promoter. Similar isoflavones relieve vasoconstriction. More work is being done to look at what are the beneficial isoflavones in white clover alfalfa, but we know that happens in red clover. Okay, now I'm going to switch gears from a legume that you know about, and you probably say, yeah, that's a pretty good legume. I just don't know whether it fits in a hay market. Hopefully I've changed your attitude a little bit. To Sericea lespedeza. Most of us would think about that as a weed, but when it was started being planted across the southeast in the 20s, 30s, 40s, it was called poor man's alfalfa because it would grow on very poor soils. I'm highlighting the work of Tom Terrell, who I was in grad school with at University of Georgia, Nikki Whitney, and others have worked on this at Fort Valley State University. Okay, this is elk hunting with my grandson in eastern Kentucky on reclaimed mine land. If you've ever been on that mine land, you notice that there's big areas of Sericea lespedeza. Now, this was in the fall of the year, so it wasn't green anymore. It looked more like that. But there's 250,000 acres of reclaimed mine land in Kentucky, in western Kentucky and eastern Kentucky. I don't know the exact numbers, Chris, but I would bet 100,000 of that has a fair bit of Sericea lespedeza. Now you say, why are you telling me that, that terrible weedy plant? So it's got a bunch of benefits as far as agronomically. Wide range of soils, will grow in acidic and fertile sites. It is a legume, so it doesn't need nitrogen. Deep-rooted, reducing the need for phosphorus. Drought-tolerant. Insect damage is very little. Disease problems are minimal. It's a warm season legume, so high production in the summer. So again, there's benefits, but why would I think about it? Dr. Terrell and others have found out that the tannins in Sericea lespedeza are powerful antiparasitic compounds. I'll give you just a little bit of data, but it can lower the egg counts for worms and also even coccidia. Anti-bloat, the tannins are. That's actually how they were one of the ways they were trying to get alfalfa to be non-bloating was to introduce, bioengineer those to have some tannin production. Reduces somatic cell count in goat milk. And if you have too much of that somatic cell count, you can't sell the goat milk. In Sericea, obviously it comes in the form of fresh forage. Very few people are cutting it for hay. If you cut it, some people would say, well, animals don't like Sericea. It's kind of bitter, and it is bitter with those tannins. But when it's dried down for hay, those tannins are bound. They're still there, but they're bound with the proteins, and so it increases the palatability. The animals will consume it better. It can be ground into leaf meal or pellets or ensiled, and I'll give you some of the, while I'm talking about the pellets in a second. Okay, there's other benefits of Sericea. So again, don't think about this as this weedy crop that nobody's going to think about growing on purpose or harvesting on purpose, as this medicinal crop that has other benefits. Lowers ruminant methane production. If you have less methane produced, you have higher gain from the animals. Reduce urinary losses of nitrogen. Antibacterial. Killed houseflies in manure. So a lot of benefits. So just a couple of things from grazing trials and similar results with hay trials. 58% reduction in egg counts with goats or with female goats, the does grazing Sericea. Lower numbers of adult worms in kids, particularly this barber pole worm, which is devastating, 94% reduction in the adult worms. Huge reductions here in egg counts with kids with Sericea. So we're talking about a medicinal feed. If someone doesn't want to, if they don't want to give the antiparasitic drugs, or in many cases, goats and sheep as well are becoming resistant. In fact, other livestock as well, resistant to some of our best antiparasitic compounds. So here's a natural compound that can provide many of the same benefits. Drying and processing the Sericea, does it reduce those antiparasitic effectiveness? So like Jonathan's work with red clover of drying it. So if you were going to actually maybe have a drum dryer produce this, or how they produce the pellets or leaf meal, where sometimes drying is a beneficial way, that doesn't affect those tannins. Feeding of whole plant and leaves, and this is showing over a period of weeks the huge reductions in the fecal egg count on both of those. So down to negligible in the period of 6 to 7 weeks. Okay, so again, I'm not telling you everybody needs to start growing Sericea, but if you're anywhere near reclaimed mine land, you can get it for free and cut it and have this high-value medicinal feed. I've put in the proceedings that my brother-in-law has planted some AU grazer Sericea down in Georgia, and he's selling Sericea lespedeza, small squares, 40-pound bales for $12 a bale to his local goat producers. You're going to cut it not when it's tall like in that reclaimed mine site. You're going to cut it when it's, a couple of feet tall, 20 inches tall. The leaves dry rapidly, so you've got to make sure that you've got a mower conditioner because the stems are pretty thick to crush those. Middle of the summer, hot day, you can often, particularly at this immature stage, cut it one day, bale it the next day after the dew dries off. And there's a company that if you wanted to plant Sericea, the best variety, in fact about the only one you can buy right now, is called AU Grazer, has the added benefit is that it has some grazing tolerance, but it's a finer stemmed Sericea, so it doesn't have those big stems like the interstate variety that was introduced a number of years ago, called interstate because they developed for planting on roadways. So finer stemmed, Sims Brothers Seed has that. Actually, they've got a lot of nice detail on their website, simsbrothers.com. But they're also selling pelleted sericea as a medicinal product to goat and sheep producers in particular. I mean, it's beneficial to knock back parasites in cattle as well, and I'm not sure if they've tried it in horses, but the small ruminants have such issues that's where the market is right now. Okay, I'm not going to say a whole lot about teff because one of our producer speakers is going to talk about the production of that a little bit. And if everyone could plant teff and get a stand of it like this, then we'd probably all be growing it because it does have some nice market potential, particularly in the horse market, as a low sugar containing grass. But it has issues, and Alan will talk about that in a little bit more from a production standpoint, particularly establishment, some lodging, things like that. But it's another crop that if you're willing to go to a fair bit of effort, you've got a unique market. And like I say, Alan will give a little bit more detail. But it is a great chance to highlight, and something that Don's already said, is he wrote the manual on growing teff grass, developed the variety Tiffany, and a newer variety that's been released called Bonus, that are useful varieties. And if you say, well, okay, I'm thinking about teff, but what should I plant? You can look in our variety publication, our summary publication. And we've got on page, well, I've lost my place here. Oh, here it is. Page 21 of this summary publication, we've got where we've tested different teff varieties, and you can see how well some have done over time. I don't have it with me, but if you go to our UK Forage's website and look under variety test, we've got where we've tested a number of different annual grasses, both warm season and cool season. And so you can go on there and look at the actual yields that we've had for teff the last few years. So here's Don had there in the front of this publication. I've got a few extra copies of this. It's also on our Forage website. Now, I'm throwing out a couple of other things, just as food for thought. And I pulled this last night down from, I was just looking at growing oats as a forage, growing oats as a hay. And I found out that in Pakistan, oats, as they call it fodder oats, but in essence oat that are raising for stored feed, hay or silage, is the number 2 most important winter feed, stored forage feed in Pakistan. And they talk about great forage for horses, sheep, and cattle. I mean, I think any of us would recognize that oats can have a high quality, but we often wouldn't think about growing that as hay. Again, we've actually tested oats planted in the spring for what kind of production they produce. We've got varieties listed on page 22 of that summary report, or again, you go to that annual grass report to look at the actual yields. But typically, when we plant mid-March and we cut 60 days later, we'll have 1.5 to 2.5 tons on that first cutting. We'll even sometimes get a bit of regrowth. So you can have a high-quality forage that's desirable. Many horse people would be glad to buy oat hay. Makes a good silage. So you've got another option kind of as a really short-term kind of emergency crop or short-term crop you could plant this time of year, maybe even go with a crop after that. This is what that annual grass report looks like. So warm season and cool season annuals. Now let me just mention just a couple of other things as considerations, some that are valid and some that probably don't fit into really marketable hay. This is sorghum Sudan grass. And here sorghum Sudan grass is in the middle, really too big a stem to think about dried hay. This is pearl millet. Here's a straight sorghum. This is Sudan grass with a smaller stem. So if you're going to produce a hay out of something in the sorghum family, then the Sudan grass would have a smaller stem. The last one there is Johnson grass, which again Nobody wants to buy that, but it can be a very high quality feed if you have it or you have it as a contaminant. But if you're selling, and many of you are, to horse customers, there's some real issues in that horses really shouldn't be consuming anything in the sorghum family. Now, Bob, there was some discrepancy over, definitely they shouldn't graze it, but the compounds, are they still present in the hay? Okay. So you've got cystitis, an inflammation of the bladder. That's going to lead to urinary disorders, lack of coordination, paralysis in severe cases. So you don't even want horses on a long-term basis consuming Johnson grass because it's in the sorghum family. Pearl millet, generally safe for equine, but foxtail millet, a short-term summer annual, when it says sparingly, I would say no, you don't want to feed it because it has a laxative effects and increased urination and kidney and bone problems. Crabgrass doesn't have problems, but the average horse customer, even though crabgrass is one of our highest quality forages, probably is not going to buy your crabgrass hay. Now, if you tell them, you might could fool them and they think it's teff because it looks kind of similar. It's got a fine stem. But crabgrass is a very high quality hay. But again, it probably doesn't have a lot of high market value. The long and the short is anything in the sorghum family and that foxtail millet aren't going to go into the horse market, shouldn't go into the horse market. So there may be other markets you could have for those other warm season annuals. I'm showing crabgrass here just because if you're growing hay for your own animals or you're selling to other beef producers, it may be an option. There's a producer in North Jefferson, South Oldham County that's growing annual ryegrass over the winter, growing crabgrass over the summer. He's putting up the annual ryegrass as baleage, he's putting up the crabgrass as hay, and he has a nice annual system there. I mean, nice in that it fits well into his program, but it's also producing some very high quality feed. Here's where Chris has planted when he was at Virginia Tech an improved crabgrass, and this is the growth 60 days after seeding. Now, any annual that you plant, Chris, you didn't always get things looking like this, did you, 60 days after seeding?
No, not always.
Yeah, 90% of the time. But, I mean, you don't always get a great stand when you're having to seed things, and Alan will talk about that a little bit more with Teff in a minute. So hopefully that's food for thought. I don't know if anybody will try this, but think about the markets that are really untapped, that have huge potential. It's going to take a little bit of market development on your part. In fact, Chris or I or other folks at the university would be glad to help you if you say, I want to think about marketing red clover as a medicinal crop. We could supply you more information if you think customers want to have more backing, more background. Okay, any questions out there? Yes, sir.
Yeah, so black patch the primary concern with red clover in horse hay?
I think that's the only concern is black patch.
It's a little dustier, right? I mean, because of the pubescence.
That's a good point. Chris made the comment that because of those fine hairs on red clover, then once it dries down, it can be a bit dusty. That's where Dr. Taylor developed the Freedom red clover that had less pubescence. So the hairs aren't the issue, but they can be a little bit more prone to being dusty.
But, I mean, like the varieties that would have a greater resistance to black patch.
There's not any varieties that we know of that have a resistance to black patch. Unless, Don, you're working on breeding that. Isabel Kagan is trying to develop a screening procedure that we could work on that. But it's a pretty prominent visible disease if you're looking at, because it does have that black appearance at the base of the plants.
And then from a medicinal standpoint, you talked about in cattle, but have they ever looked at vasodilator effect horses?
Okay, the question I'm forgetting, I'm telling everybody to repeat questions. I'm forgetting to repeat it myself. Question was, what about vasodilation in horses? Horses do have vasoconstriction or vasoconstriction in eating toxic tall fescue. Bob, do you know if they've looked at bile-canin A? I mean, not bile-canin A, but the other isoflavones in horses? I would assume since they have a vasodilation in humans that they probably would, but I don't know that we've looked at that. That would be a good thing to put on the radar of the USDA folks. Yes?
If you're wanting to add 3-CL into a forage mixture like pasture, what rate would you see
On the banner there in front of the plants, we've got seeding rates. Chris, I think you're a pretty high seeding rate with Sericea, probably a 25 pound, because it's a pretty big seed. And Sericea is, even though it's very tolerant once it gets growing, it's a very weak seedling. So if you're going to plant it, you really need to kill out what's there or severely suppress it. And you'd be better to do that and have almost a pure stand and then add grass back into it or let grass fill back in over time than try to. It's not going to just drill into clover drill into grass like red clover would do.